Hi everyone, this is Dr. Lagos, and today I'll be giving part two of the two-part series of King George I of the Greeks. In my last podcast, I discussed how King George was selected, the territory that came along with his assumption of the throne, and the domestic situation that dominated the Greek landscape. So when King George I was selected, he brought with him the Ionian Islands. Through later in his reign in 1881, the territory of Thessaly was also given to the Greek state, which was of huge benefit for its agricultural production. In other domestic affairs, the rise of greater ports and roadway development dominated the thinking of many politicians. And I talked about the 1,000 individuals who graduated by 1862 who could assume administrative and political positions in the Greek state. Yet the type of voting system that brought politicians to power can be characterized as patronage politics, what I call clientelism. And clientelism, this I scratch your back, you scratch mine, is not unique to Greece, but rather indicative of many Mediterranean countries and Central and South American countries. So today I'd like to focus on more international affairs and territorial aspirations for the Greek state. The two case studies that I'm going to be focusing on in this podcast are the island of Crete and the Macedonian lands. And if you go back to the Greek War of Independence, there may have been Cretan participation, Cretan assistance given. Yet by the end of the Greek War of Independence, the newly created country of Greece did not include the island of Crete as part of its territorial boundaries. In fact, the individual that was selected to rule and administer the island was none other than Ibrahim Pasha, that ruthless and very heavy-handed individual who burned up most of the Peloponnese and caused Kolokotronis a lot of headaches. It is this individual who employs many of the techniques that we saw discussed in the Kolokotronis memoirs to the island of Crete. For the Greeks on the island, who were numerically the overwhelming majority, and yes, there was an Ottoman presence, mostly imported from the empire for administrative purposes, or some who happened to own territory on the island. For them, the big dream was to be incorporated into the Greek state. They see other unification movements occurring throughout the 19th century, the discussions of nationalism in Italy and Germany, and these are going to take firm root on the island. For them, it is a question of how and when can a situation arise for them to be inducted into the modern Greek state. So from 1830 to about 1868, we see Ibrahim Pasha and his ruthless type of administration on the island. By 1868, the growing tensions that had burbled in Greek society had basically boiled over, and there were many revolts and protests against Ibrahim Pasha's rule. In 1868, a very, very well-known revolt occurred. And what makes this different than previous ones is that on June 15th, 1868, there was a massive massacre of Greeks in the city of Heraklion. And if you look at my map here, it's about right here, Heraklion today. So because of the press coverage that this had generated, and I can show you what this looks like. You can see the image here on the left. Notice the religious symbolism that obviously one of the messages that is going to be spread to the European powers is that this is a war of religions, Christianity versus Islam, and when the Europeans support the Christians in their campaign. So because of this massacre that got widespread coverage internationally, the great powers decided to send in reinforcements and ships and press for immediate armistice. The mediation by the great powers secured a more beneficial pact, governing type of pact for the island. And this is known as the Organic Statute of 1868. What is included in the Organic Statute? That Crete is going to be divided into 5 provinces and 19 districts. The governor general and commander in chief are going to be positions, and the commander in chief is to be given to a Greek Orthodox Christian. In addition, the Greek language would be considered equal to Ottoman Turkish as an administrative language. So all administrative laws, rules, policies, regulations had to be issued in both Ottoman Turkish and in the Greek language. Finally, there's going to be a General Assembly for each of the 5 provinces on the island. And with this organic statute, we're going to see peace kind of prevailing for the next 3 years. Yet in 1871, and this is the end of the Franco-Prussian War and the unification of Germany that is going on in Central Europe, we're going to see the Cretans begin to then take on aspirations of maybe organizing a revolutionary movement or organizing revolts, capitalizing on external event to somehow push Crete closer to the Greek mainland. And their goal is unification. The Greek term for this is enosis, E-N-O-S-I-S. Now, this term of unification, enosis, you're also going to hear be applied repeatedly for the island of Cyprus in the mid-20th century. So another event, international event, is going to occur in 1877 that gives the Greeks on the island of Crete hope, and that is the Russo-Turkish War. Remember the Russo-Turkish War that had occurred, and the Greeks really couldn't get involved, but on the island of Crete, they were overjoyed because they could take this opportunity to organize their own revolt, similar to that had occurred in the Greek mainland in 1821, to see if they could get their own political freedom and liberation. However, their fighting was not going to be met with political freedom. The Ottomans, who are going to be defeated, were sending some forces down to crush the revolts on the island. Despite the fact that the Ottoman Empire was defeated in the Russo-Turkish War, Crete did not get independence. As much as the Greeks had petitioned for unification of the island, the best that the great powers could do, because they were giving compensations to other Balkan states in the Treaty of San Stefano, decided to appease the Greeks and gave something to improve the status of the Greeks on the island of Crete. This is known as the Pact of Halepa in 1878. What does it really do for the Greeks? It basically gave greater autonomy for the island. It included 3 main characteristics, among others. First, that there should be a General Assembly that is comprised of 49 Christian Greek representatives and 39 Ottoman Turkish, basically Muslim, representatives. And note when I use these religious titles, it is because ethnic groups are not typically labeled as Greek or Serb or Turkish. Rather, they're used in the religious faith. That's the labeling. So that's why I'll use those terms interchangeably. So 49 Greeks to 39 Ottoman Turks would comprise a General Assembly. Notice that the weight is falling to the benefit of the Greeks. Number 2, official positions on the island would be given automatically or heavily preference to individuals who are born and raised on the island. Up until this point, it was very easy for a sultan to send an administrator from the imperial capital, maybe from Izmir or another territory in the Ottoman Empire, and send that individual to Crete to govern. With the Pact of Halepa, it was recognized that somebody needed to be born and raised on the island who might have a vested interest and knowledge of the affairs and needs of the island in order to administrate it more properly. Number 3, this has to do with tax revenue. So the tax revenue that is generated from those living on the island, they would have to pay X amount, say of dollars, to the imperial capital. Yet with the treaty, the Pact of Halepa, a portion, actually half of the tax revenue that used to be earmarked to go to Istanbul was now redirected back to the island to improve the roads, to improve the communication, to improve the ports. So all sorts of infrastructural development and investment to improve the living conditions of the people on the island. So with these three factors, among others in the pact, and I won't bore you with the rest of them today, what the overall picture of the Pact of Jalepa is that the Ottoman presence was now a minority presence, that they were beginning to be marginalized and isolated, and that the Greek presence is going to be the dominant one. Yet with this, there are going to be two divergent types of opinions by the Greeks. There is going to be a group of Greeks, and those are going to be represented in the local assemblies, who actually pursued greater autonomy for the island. These are individuals who like to work within the system to get a better living situation for the Cretan peoples, the Greek Cretans. And they didn't really kind of support a lot of revolution and revolts and really type of aggressive campaigning. The other faction is known as those for enosis, the unification group. These individuals didn't see the Pact of Jalepa as something that they say, hey, that's fantastic. Let's wait for another international event to see where we can go. They thought we need to take action. We need to continuously cause problems on the island in order to keep the situation of the Greeks in the minds of the European leaders, the great powers, in order for us to be able to achieve unification to the island. In 1889, the Enosis Party took on a majority in the General Assembly. With the minute that these individuals took on majority kind of influence, all of a sudden, what do we see on the island? An uptick in violence and revolts. And how did all of these revolts and revolutionary activities spontaneously occur? They didn't happen out of thin air. Rather, there were communications to organize underground revolutionary nationalistic groups that were kind of modeled against the Philiki Eteria, the friendly society that had existed in Greece. Remember those individuals who helped organize and lead the campaign for Greek independence? They were similar ones on the island of Crete, and they named themselves very similarly to the Philiki Eteria. In fact, they named themselves as the Ethniki Eteria, the national society. So you have the friendly society for the mainland and the national society for the Cretans. Violence broke out on the island. And here the Sultan decided to take swift and very direct measures to quash these rebellions. He decided to send a military presence to the island and immediately put down all of the violence. To cap off this violent, this kind of military response, the Sultan issued a political response. He issued a firman, meaning a law that rescinded many aspects of the Pact of Jalepa. He restricted membership to the Cretan Assembly and appointed a Turkish governor who was to hold office for an indefinite period of time, meaning forever or until the Sultan was displeased with this individual. How did the Greeks respond? Incredibly disappointed. The Cretans were absolutely dumbfounded, the Greeks on the island, because they felt that they were trying to move forward, and instead of taking a step forward, they were forced to take 2, 3, 10 steps backwards. What was the international response? The Sultan said, very well, this was an opportunity that he was able to turn to his advantage. As for the Europeans, a swift response was taken up by Germany, which said that this was a domestic affair of the Ottoman Empire. I believe Otto von Bismarck was the individual who said that this was a domestic issue and that European powers should not get involved in domestic affairs of a foreign country. With that, Britain and France couldn't say very much. So the firman, the rescinding of aspects of the Pact of Jalepa, stood. So the Cretans took a very big step backwards, and those for Enosis were obviously very disappointed, hurt, and angered by the outcome. Yet another situation is going to come up almost within the space of 10 years. In 1897, Velianis declares war on the Ottoman Empire, hopefully to acquire territory in the Macedonian lands. This is going to turn out to be a huge fiasco for the Greek state, and the Ottoman forces are easily able to rout the Greeks and lead them to a swift defeat. Fortunately, armistice is going to come from the great powers' intervention to kind of soften the blow to the Greeks. On the island of Crete, they saw this as their golden opportunity to revolt again in order to get some sort of independence, to make up for the losses in the Pact of Halepo, and if not, go even further. Unfortunately for them, this was not to be the case, for as the successes of the Ottoman powers, Ottoman military forces against the Greeks, so too were they successful against the Cretans. However, here, what the Ottoman Sultan thought would be a slam dunk for him to move the Greeks even further back and restrict them even more, he ended up getting slammed. The military presence, the Ottoman military presence on the island actually killed foreign individuals. And these foreign individuals who happened to be on the island consisted of 14 British Marines and the British vice consul himself. All of a sudden, the Ottoman Empire made an attack on Great Britain, and Great Britain is going to respond extremely quickly. Immediately, Great Britain decides to send communication that the Turkish fleet and forces evacuate the island. Turkey immediately turns to Germany and Austria to get some sort of assistance and some mediation. But at this point, the pressure placed by Great Britain on Germany and Austria, with the support of other European countries, was too much for the Germans and Austrians to counter. The Ottoman Empire had to give in, and within 15 days, the Sultan withdrew the forces. The end of this kind of conflict and fiasco now for the Ottoman Empire came up with an agreement in 1898. This new agreement goes beyond the Pact of Halepo and really sends a clear signal both to the rest of Europe, the international community, but more directly towards Greece and the Ottoman Empire about what the destiny of Crete is to be. Basically, Prince George, who is one of the sons of King George I, is going to be labeled now as High Commissioner. So the Turkish Governor General is removed and Prince George comes in. That a nominal amount of tax revenue is going to be given to the Sultan in Istanbul, and a new constitution is going to be written up, and included in this constitutional assembly of who's going to write and how the constitution is going to look like is a young, ambitious, charismatic, and very knowledgeable individual by the name of Eleftherios Venizelos. We're going to talk about him in our next podcast. So with this new constitution for the island, Prince George is the High Commissioner, and basically an X amount of taxes going to the empire. Crete's destiny for Greece has been clearly laid out. It was only a matter of time before Crete were formally cut off from the Ottoman Empire, and its unification, its enosis to Greece, was secure. So I'm going to stop here with Crete, because the next action that is going to occur, and I'm going to talk about in my next podcast, is going to happen in 1909. And this is going to lead to massive changes both on the island of Crete and sweeping new changes for the country of Greece. So now let's move on to our next case study, and that is of Macedonia. Now, Macedonia is an interesting question, problem, conflict, one that has dominated since the late 19th century and still continues on even today as we speak. So what is the Macedonian question? That is, where, to what country does Macedonia belong? If you go back in history, the last time we talked about a Macedonia is with Alexander the Great. Following his death, this territory is going to be incorporated in the Roman Empire. During Ottoman times, if you look at maps written by Ottoman officials, the term Macedonia is actually not used. Other terms are used to spell out or label this geographic area. One of the more common ones is Paeania. So Macedonia is not a term that is used by Ottoman officials, but one that is taken up and redeployed for very specific political purposes. So since the mid-19th century, it was becoming abundantly clear that the Ottoman Empire was in decline. With the rise of new Balkan states, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, Bulgaria, and others, there were hopes and dreams of kicking out the Ottoman Empire from Europe for good. Each one of these Balkan states had a territorial aspiration similar to the Greeks. They all had their megali ideas, their great ideas. The problem with all of these great ideas is that they happen to overlap on similar territory. One piece of territory that three different countries all laid claim to were the Macedonian lands. The three countries that competed for these territories were Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia. So from the middle of the 18th century on, how do they approach this question? They decide to employ European criteria for national identity. How did the Europeans come up with, all right, this country or these people are X ethnicity? How do they determine it? Or how do they determine a piece of land belongs to country X as opposed to Y or Z? The criteria they're going to use are language, religious affiliation, and local customs and a person's history in the region, how long they've lived there. So when going to the Balkan lands, during Ottoman times, I talked about the decline in literacy amongst the Greek people. There's also large migrations, moving of peoples from one area to another, kind of a blending of cultures. And over the course of 400 years, you get groups of people who might speak a combination of various languages, a base language, and then adopting or incorporating words from another language. This is something that we saw very clearly in the northern part of Greece. So they are considered mixed, and many of the Balkan countries want to unmix that, or basically tease out and emphasize a dominant ethnicity amongst these people. So how are these Balkan states going to approach it? They're going to approach it in the latter half of the 19th century by establishing a series of schools and churches throughout the Balkans. If you remember my first podcast on the overview of Greece and the Greek lands, one of the critical points that I made had to do with religion and Eastern Orthodoxy in general. It is very different to Western Catholicism because as the Orthodox faith developed over time, it took on nationalist components, meaning that the language of services were given in various languages. This would then be labeled on the type of church. Therefore, you would have a Greek Orthodox Church, a Serbian Orthodox Church, a Romanian Orthodox Church, a Bulgarian Orthodox Church. What do those ethnic appellations mean? They mean that the service is given in Greek, Serbian, Romanian, Bulgarian. In the Western Catholic world, all of the services up until Vatican II were given in Latin. Then different languages are going to be used following that. But for the Eastern Orthodox peoples, religion takes on a national component and gets exploited for political purposes. And this is exactly what is going to be happening in the Macedonian lands. So the Serbs, Bulgarians, and Greeks are all going to be setting up Orthodox churches throughout this area. They're going to be setting up schools so that they could try to compel as many students as possible, as many children as possible, entire villages as possible, to start going to X school and going to X church, because if European cartographers and demographers come there, they're going to take a little census and they say, what do you speak? I speak Greek. Which church do you go to? The Greek Orthodox. Oh, therefore you're Greek. And now you're kind of redeveloping your connection to your Greek origins. So this is kind of like Cold War conflict in a sense, that while you don't see outright violence occurring, it is kind of an indirect way of trying to nationalize the people there. Now, a more violent component is going to begin to emerge at the end of the 19th century. And there is one group that I really want you to pay attention to. because they're going to change the stakes of the game in Macedonia completely. And this group is called IMRO, I-M-R-O, Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. Now, it had existed as a movement in the 1850s in support of Bulgaria. What was their task? To go and persuade these people in the Macedonian territories that they were actually ethnically Bulgarian, and that if they didn't quite believe them, if they weren't compelled to go to the churches of the church, accidentally maybe their flock of sheep might die, or accidentally run off a cliff, or orchards might accidentally catch fire and be burned to the ground. So the IMRO took a little stronger approach to intimidating and encouraging people that their connection was really to Bulgaria. But in 1893, this internal Macedonian movement kind of rethinks their purpose. And in 1893, they renamed themselves as Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization and say, we are not working in support of the Bulgarian government. Rather, we are in support of the Macedonian people, meaning that these individuals are unique, separate, ethnically different from the Serbs, Bulgarians, and the Greeks. All of a sudden, the entire discourse had changed. The birth of a Macedonian people and their understanding of their uniqueness and separateness from their Balkan neighbors has been established. This tension now, the activities of IMRO are now going to alter the stakes in the game. Pretty soon, these Balkan countries are going to actively begin thinking of more violent approaches to taking on the land and more heavy-handed ways of nationalizing. How this is going to play out and who is going to emerge as a victor in the conflict over Macedonia, we're going to talk about in a future podcast about the Balkan War. There, we'll see the tensions between Bulgaria and Greece firmly established that soured relationships between the two countries for the entire 20th century. I'll talk about that later after my discussion of the rise of Eleftherios Venizelos. Thank you for joining me. Talk to you later.